Hi everyone, my name is Emily Peraza. I'm a data scientist at Battelle Memorial Institute, and today I'm going to be talking about the wide area decontamination model. Now, there are many types of emergencies and disasters that threaten the stability of society. Among the most serious are biological incidents for which government agencies have a specific interest in developing mitigation strategies. The wide area decontamination model was developed to address the need for a methodology that would aid in the planning for such events by characterizing wide area indoor, outdoor, and underground biological incidents, estimating the cost and time associated with the decontamination of these site areas, and implementing a methodology for estimating efficacy or the effectiveness of a given treatment at reducing the contaminant level present on a given surface. The wide area decontamination model is driven by a series of equations developed to characterize the cost and time associated with each step or element of the decontamination process, including the preliminary sampling of surfaces to define initial contaminant levels, the removal of waste from the site area to decrease the cost of decontamination, the treatment of surfaces to remove contaminant, the resampling of surfaces to determine the effectiveness of treatment, and the sampling of waste materials to determine proper disposal procedures. The development model is probabilistic in nature, meaning parameters can be defined as distributions, allowing for any uncertainty surrounding these parameters to be accounted for within the model. Now, the model calculations are broken out into 7 individual elements of Decon, each of which is performed in the same order for all 3 scenario types, indoor, outdoor, and underground. Starting with incident command, which is the oversight and management of all personnel and all decontamination processes. And this element is ongoing throughout the entire decontamination event. Characterization sampling is the process by which surfaces within the contaminated area are sampled in order to determine the initial level of contaminant present. Source reduction is the process of removing contaminated material from the site area to save the cost of decontaminating said materials. And this is heavily dependent upon the decontamination method and requires decisions to be made regarding which materials require source reduction and which require decontamination. And decontamination itself is the process of neutralizing any contaminants to a given safety threshold. And this element relies on the efficacy model, which we'll discuss in more detail later on, in order to predict how effective a specific decontamination treatment method will be when applied to a given surface, allowing for multiple rounds of decon on the same surfaces. And then clearance sampling is performed after each round of decon to determine how much contaminant was removed from surfaces via treatment and to determine if an additional round of treatment is required. Waste sampling is then required to determine the level of contamination present in the waste that will be removed from the site area and disposed of. And this information is useful to determine where waste will be disposed of and how, as certain safety measures are necessary in order to meet relevant waste acceptance criteria. And then finally, the model also considers additional costs associated with travel to and from the site area for teams associated with each element of the decon process. For each of these 7 elements, a total cost and duration is calculated by the model. So the total cost of incident command is based on the cost associated with incident command personnel, as well as the cost of any supplies and rentals that may be required. And the total duration of incident command is based on the total duration of characterization sampling, the total duration of source reduction, the duration of decontamination, clearance sampling, and waste sampling summed. The total cost of characterization sampling is based on the cost associated with clearance or characterization sampling personnel, the cost of any supplies and rentals required for sampling, the cost associated with personnel entering and exiting the site area, including PPE costs, and the cost of analyzing each sample, including the costs associated with packaging and transport of samples. And then the total duration of characterization sampling is based on the time required to physically sample the site area, the time associated with entering and exiting the site area, including any entry prep, personnel, decon line time, and post-entry rest periods, any setup and teardown days required for characterization sampling, and any time that samples spend at external labs for analysis and testing. The total cost of source reduction is based on the cost associated with source reduction personnel, as well as the cost associated with personnel entering and exiting the site area. And the total duration of source reduction is based on the time required to remove material from the site, to the time associated with entering and exiting the site area, and any setup and teardown days required for source reduction. Now, the model itself, and specifically the decontamination element, are primarily driven by efficacy. The decontamination element follows an iterative process where the number of iterations of decon is determined by an efficacy value. So sampling is performed on all surfaces first to determine the amount of contaminant present on each individual surface. And then an efficacy value is drawn from a series of distributions which were informed by the BioDecon compendium for each surface based on the decontamination method applied to that surface. The efficacy value is applied to the loading on the applicable surface, reducing the overall spore loading on that surface. And then sampling is performed again to determine if another round of decontamination is required for any surfaces. So that being said, the total cost of decontamination is based on the cost associated with decontamination personnel, the cost of any supplies and rentals required for decon, including any material required for the various decon methods included in the model, the cost associated with personnel entering and exiting the site area. The total duration of decontamination is based on the time required to apply each necessary treatment, including any time required for drying or venting, for the number of iterations determined by the efficacy model, as well as any setup and teardown days required for decontamination. The total cost of clearance sampling is based on the cost associated with clearance sampling personnel, the cost of any supplies and rentals required for sampling, the cost associated with personnel entering and exiting the site area, and the cost of analyzing each sample. And the total duration is based on the time required to physically sample the site area after each round of decontamination, the time associated with entering and exiting the site area, any setup and teardown days required for clearance sampling, and then any time that samples spend at external labs for analysis and testing. And the total cost of waste sampling is based on the cost associated with waste sampling personnel, the cost of any supplies and rentals required for waste sampling, the cost associated with personnel entering and exiting the site area, and the cost of analyzing each waste sample. And the total duration is based on the time required to physically sample the waste, the time associated with entering and exiting the site area, any setup and teardown days that are required for waste sampling, and any time that waste samples spend at external labs for analysis and testing. And then finally, the cost of travel is based on the cost of per diem and lodging calculated for each person for the entire duration they are present on site, plus any round trip days, the cost of one round trip ticket for each person present on site, and then the cost of car rentals for all personnel for the duration of any round trip days. Now, we include various cost and time results that are calculated by the model as are demonstrated in the screenshot from the wide area decontamination tool, including the total cost, the total area contaminated, total work days and on-site days, and then the number of decon iterations that were performed. And a breakdown of cost and work days is also included for each element within the decon process. And finally, each scenario can be run multiple times, up to 10,000 times, and the results show the potential range of outcomes based on the input uncertainty. Now, in order to assess the validity of the model, two mock decontamination efforts were identified and developed into scenarios to be run within the model. The first being the Bioresponse Operational Testing and Evaluation Project, or BOAT, and the second, the Underground Transportation Restoration Operational Technology Demonstration, or UTR-OTD. And during this validation process, these scenarios were run each with 10,000 model realizations, and the results were compared to the values identified in each respective report. And then changes were made to the model wherever shortcomings were identified within the comparisons. So the final results for the boat validation study are shown here. And you'll note that one model run was completed with fumigation applied to all surfaces, and then another was completed using liquid spray decontamination on all surfaces, as these are the two decon methods that were used during the mock scenario. And it was an indoor scenario, so it is applicable only to the indoor scenario type. And additionally, for these runs, at the time that the validation study was completed, clearance sampling and characterization sampling were both included within one element in the model within characterization sampling. However, the current model has those two elements split out individually. But the results here are the averages for 10,000 realizations. And I'll note here quickly that the difference between workdays and on-site days is that workdays includes only the physical element process being completed, as well as any additional time due to entrances to the site area. And then the on-site days includes the workdays as well as any lab days and overhead days. So the biggest discrepancies to note here are due to the inclusion of the amount of time samples spend at external labs for analysis and testing. Specifically, this is seen in the on-site days for characterization sampling, waste sampling, and incident command, since it's not believed that this time was included in the boat project report details. And then the final results for the UTR-OTD validation study are shown here. For this case, one model run was completed with fogging and then another with liquid spray, as those were the two decon methods used in this scenario. And this scenario was an underground scenario only, so only the underground scenario type is applicable. You will note too that the source reduction values are not included in these tables. The source reduction was not completed for UTR-OTD. And again, the clearance sampling results were included at the time in the characterization sampling results. But we see a similar pattern in these results as we did with boat, where the number of on-site days for sampling and incident command is somewhat higher due to the inclusion of lab days, while the remaining results align closely with the reported values. And with that, I will conclude my presentation of the wide area decon model. If you have any questions, my contact information is included here, so please feel free to reach out. Thank you.